Hi, everyone. You're probably just now coming in. You're in the right spot. You're in the place to be. You're here with the Black Studies Colloquium, and we're going to be presenting the work of Evelyn Simien. But just for a couple minutes, we're going to let people trickle in because I know that transition between Zoom rooms can take a moment. But in 1 or 2 minutes, I'm going to begin the program. So just take your time. And the only thing that I ask is if we can keep our microphones on mute. You're more than welcome to show your faces. Love to see you. Also understand that we're all in different spaces right now. I also invite you all to use the chat, share questions throughout the program as well. So again, we're just going to wait a couple of minutes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start. Again, I want to welcome you all to the Black Studies Colloquium. My name is Erica Richardson. I'm in the English department here at Baruch, and I'm the director of the Black Studies Colloquium. So again, as I mentioned today, we are so lucky to have Professor Evelyn Simien present some of her work on historic firsts in US elections. A conversation will then follow, moderated by our own Angie Beeman in the Marxe School. But before we go into it, I want to say a little bit about the Black Studies Colloquium. We're a fairly new program. We actually began spring of 2020, which was, as we all know, a time of many challenges and changes, and yet also a time to create community. And I was so fortunate to have the support of different colleagues, Shelley Eversley, chair of Black and Latino Studies, and many others just support me and support others as we developed an interdisciplinary working group dedicated to developing, disseminating, and also just creatively engaging with Black studies across Baruch and then beyond Baruch. The Black Studies Colloquium has works in progress, writing workshops, professional development opportunities, and events like we have today where we're really thinking about the scholarship in so many interdisciplinary ways. I say all this to encourage you all to invite your students, invite fellow faculty members here and beyond Baruch to participate in the colloquium. Again, my name is Erica Richardson. You're more than welcome to email me if you have ideas about events or if you would like to workshop and share your own work. And to that end, I'm actually going to drop our link into the chat. And then I am also briefly going to share an opportunity that is connected with this event. So hold on, let me make sure I have the right screen share up. You can see all the work that I'm developing, our busy, multiple tabs open, lifestyles as professors. Here we go. So again, this is the Black Studies Colloquium page. And if you click on archive, you can see some of our past events. After this one, I will have a recording posted here, which is important because we are inviting students to respond to Professor Simien's work. And we've already had some students so inspired by her thought, by her ideas about symbolics and empowerment. So this is featured here. Student engagement opportunity, the work of one of our students, one of Angie's students, who Angie brilliantly worked with and helped think through some of this process. So again, we're soliciting or looking for student engagement in the form of creative response, op-ed style critical response, 150, 350 words. So short form pieces, but again, a chance to really engage with their thinking in addition to our own scholarship and research. Oops. Let me stop the share. So now to begin our program, I want to, oh, sorry, I lost sight of my screen. I want to first welcome our colleague, Professor Angie Beeman. Angie Beeman's work examines the evolution of racism, its intersection with economic inequality, and how this process affects institutional practices, identities, and interracial organizing. Her work has addressed how organizations can build more equitable environments, as well as the challenges diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives pose for people of color. Her forthcoming book, Liberal White Supremacy, addresses the role progressives play in silencing racial and class oppression and examines differences between liberal and radical organizing. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Angie, who will then go on to introduce Evelyn Simien. Angie, you may take it away.
Thank you, Erica. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm very honored to introduce our guest, Dr. Evelyn Simien. Dr. Simien is a professor of political science and director of race, ethnicity, and politics master's degree program at the University of Connecticut. She's authored several important articles and books, including Black Votes Count, But Do They Matter? Symbolic Empowerment and the Jackson-Obama Mobilizing Effect on Gender and Age Cohorts, which was published in American Politics Research. She's also published Hillary Clinton and the Women Who Supported Her, Emotional Attachments in the 2008 presidential or Democratic presidential primary in Du Bois Review. And she's published several other books, including Gender and Lynching, The Politics of Memory and Black Feminist Voices in Politics, and her book, Historic First, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes US Politics, was a finalist for the National Conference on Black Political Scientists 2016 W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award. Her work has appeared in USA Today, Fortune, on WNPR, and PBS NewsHour. She's also an award-winning, nationally recognized teacher. Dr. Simien will be speaking with us today about her most recent book, Historic First in US Elections, Trailblazing Candidates in Gubernatorial, Congressional, and Mayoral Campaigns. Welcome, Dr. Simien, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Angie. And by the way, I must say that website's pretty impressive. I'm a little inspired. I need to make some changes to my website for the master's degree program. I like that little archive you got going on there. So without further ado, I'll get started. Can you see my PowerPoint? Or do I need to reshare? Okay, give me a moment. There we go. You see it?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, as Angie introduced me, she named several of my books as well as articles, especially those that are related to today's topic. So I'm extremely excited to present this work. The book is in production with Routledge Press. And so I'm always amped and excited to discuss my work. I love what I do. I could talk on and on at length for several hours about this subject. I am fascinated, intrigued, inspired by countless historic firsts. And so I'll be talking about this book as sort of a sequel to my previous book, which was published with Oxford University Press. And Angie did reference it as Historic First, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes US Politics. And so I'll begin with an introduction that kicks off by giving you sort of the overall framework that is the driver behind this work. Oh, there we go. Introduction. This is the book cover for the book that is due out in April. As I said earlier, it's in production with Routledge. The full title is Historic First in US Elections, Trailblazing Candidates in Gubernatorial, Congressional, and Mayoral Campaigns. I don't take for granted that people know the individuals on the cover, but those featured here are also representing chapters that are in this book. The Florida gubernatorial candidate is the one male featured on the cover, Andrew Gillum. Then there are 3 congressional candidates who are also members of the squad, Omar Talib Presley, who you see frequently in the news. And then lastly, in the bottom right corner is London Breed, that is the mayor of San Francisco. I will speak briefly about each of their campaigns, but I want to kick off with an introduction. By all accounts, voter turnout soared during the 2018 congressional midterm and the 2020 American presidential elections. Historic First have since received an unprecedented amount of media attention for their legislative advocacy and progressive policy positions. Kamala Harris, in particular, as a Historic First, has also received a tremendous amount of attention post-election. As trailblazers, they changed the nature of political representation as we know it, and exposed the complex intersections of inequality and marginalization at work, which becomes evident via the conservative backlash and voter suppression efforts we witness in the aftermath of their elections. The Historic First candidacies of gubernatorial, congressional, and mayoral candidates featured here challenge the electoral norms and confront the political institutions that have long advantaged white men. As evidenced by the lineup of candidates from 2018 and the record number of women and men of color who ran for the American presidency in 2020, the gains made by Historic First were concentrated among Democrats at every level and have practical implications for the substantive representation of minority interest. While evaluating their respective game-changing performances offers us keen insights into the future of American elections, researching first for women and men of color across levels of office serves as a reminder of the work left to be done to ensure that our political institutions reflect the full range of the constituencies they serve. That said, the election of Historic First has palpable effects on American voters and the practice of democracy, especially when such candidates disrupt the white male status quo in American politics and challenge basic assumptions about how, where, and which candidates can achieve electoral success. Nevertheless, there is very little evidence to suggest that the significance of such trailblazers is acknowledged by the discipline of political science and the American politics subfield. In fact, the silence is astounding. Having elevated the status of Historic First as subjects of importance, I offer some brief reflections on the possible implications of their breakthrough elections for scholars in political science and practitioners on the ground. Along the way, I will discuss how the symbolic empowerment framework is applied to actual cases. The expectations that future researchers will pick up where I and others have left off. My research question. Historic First in US elections examines barrier-breaking figures across various types of elective offices and constituent groups. I ask, do trailblazing candidates bring formally politically inactive people into the electoral process? This is the key question that motivates this study. The statement of the problem is threefold here. As I have argued elsewhere, Historic First candidates must be judged on their own terms rather than those used to evaluate more traditional mainstream candidates. Disciplinary conventions in political science import a range of assumptions and truth claims about what constitutes quote unquote success and contributes to the erasure of Historic First candidates who failed to win election, like Stacey Abrams or Andrew Gillum or Shirley Chisholm or Jesse Jackson, and the list could go on. Dismissing their campaigns as inconsequential despite their use of the electoral system differently. strict vote counts or turnout do not fully capture their long-term impact, which exceeds the timeline of any single election. Trailblazers pave the way and create the opportunity for future candidates and subsequent victories, especially when their unexpected game-changing performances set them apart. The impact factor of such historic first candidates cannot be assessed by traditional measures, given their alternative performance goals include non-voting participation and affords others what we call a coattails advantage. It is therefore reasonable to assume that historic firsts pay the dues and improve the electoral prospects for future candidates to be taken more seriously as viable candidates. The number of historic candidates who have been erased from larger political narratives of state and local politics, the US Congress, and presidential elections is astounding. Because of this far too frequent occurrence in college and university classrooms, as well as high school civics or American government textbooks, the work of this book begins by laying the groundwork for future studies of gubernatorial, congressional, and mayoral contests. It leaves readers with what I believe is a deeper appreciation for historic first, have longstanding effects on new segments of the American polity, whether they win or lose, such that unsuccessful campaigns also have implications for the future of a growing number of historic candidates seeking executive office. Symbolic empowerment, which is the central organizing key concept, which I will describe shortly, transforms an otherwise bleak situation for the better by way of a priming influence. While the candidate's public visibility as it raises the salience of identities, for example, race, ethnicity, and gender, shared by the candidate with American voters is important, historic first candidates also want members of their city, state, or home district to recognize them as one of them based on their policy preferences, not simply their physical characteristics. Given the strong desire to behave in a way that their constituents would be proud, and because they stand to give prominence to issues that otherwise would be ignored, historic first build trust in government institutions. Such a powerful dynamic whereby historic candidates are cognizant of their status and understand the process by which they stand for dispossessed subgroup members of their constituent base can revitalize democracy and strengthen its legitimacy by virtue of both their presence as well as their performance. While it's well understood that race and gender influence the ways in which historic first campaign, surprisingly little research exists on how dual or multiple group identities interact to affect who is mobilized and how voters behave in local, state, and national elections. So at the heart of this book is a key concept: symbolic empowerment. It suggests that historic first matter insofar as they mobilize new segments of the American electorate. The moment in which historic first candidates enter the electoral arena and the campaign ensues is described in terms of contextual effects that are symbolically empowering. The cumulative effect of their multiple identities and the historic nature of their campaign stoke the desire to vote and to participate in other ways, from attending a campaign rally to donating money, giving someone a ride to the polls, despite problems that arise in dealing with traditional opponents, from the injection of coded racial appeals, or what we call dog whistles, to the distortion of their legislative records and altered images and commercial ads and political cartoons. The presence of a historic first candidate who mirrors a marginalized group pictorially signals greater access to electoral opportunities and motivates political behavior from the kind of voters that political analysts had often written off, who are on the margins of American politics, on the outside looking in. These races, as we all know, are hard fought. The stakes are high, especially when historic first unite diverse electorates and establish multiracial coalitions in opposition to conservatives who seek to suppress votes and impose ballot restrictions. Loyalty, or a sense of belonging to the group in question, facilitates the process whereby what I call a strong, effective intragroup emotion like pride results in an ego-enhancing appraisal of the event and the public figure associated with a socially valued outcome, that being, in this case, the election of a historic first. They who act as change agents on the campaign trail emerge as nothing less than lightning rods for more liberal and progressive public policies. As such, historic candidacies are inextricably tied to questions of representation, electability, and performance. Prior research. Historic First in Elections builds upon my previous work by extending the symbolic empowerment framework to the Trump era, and by shifting the focus from the historic first of presidential campaigns, Shirley Chisholm and Jesse Jackson, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama, to more recent history-making first of gubernatorial, congressional, and mayoral campaigns. I call it part 2, the sequel to this first book. In Historic First, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes US Politics, I argued that the historic entry of the above presidential hopefuls changed the nature of American presidential elections. I asked, did their historic candidacies, whether it be Chisholm, Jackson, Clinton, or Obama, change the levels of political engagement for various groups across race, ethnicity, and gender? In a nutshell, this is what I do. Significance of this study. Now more than ever, in my mind, research on the mobilization of American voters is vitally important for understanding the effect of historic first and their consequences for recent campaigns, as well as the future of democratic leadership in the United States. We live in a fragile democracy at this time. Symbolic empowerment, a theory of election campaigns involving historic first candidates, goes beyond the traditional Black-white paradigm and considers the impact of multiracial and multi-ethnic constituencies on American behavioral studies. Which brings me to the purpose of my work. The goal is to provide a more comprehensive study of vote choice and election outcomes with support for historic first, serving as yet another explanatory variable alongside other sources of variation, like political context, geographic space, constituent base, campaign strategy on the ground, spending or fundraising, etc. Given the psychological and social factors linked to identity categories in each context under examination in this book, researchers and readers alike should come to understand the importance of identity for segments of the mass public that are far from homogeneous, but rather heterogeneous in some of the country's fastest growing areas due to increases in immigration. To be sure, identity alignment between candidates and voters is symbolically empowering and mobilizing for certain populations, and especially multicultural urban milieus. At the same time, the overarching context from which historic first emerged onto the political scene in 2018, often referred to as the Trump era, is just as analytically important. That is to say, context matters. Does this symbolic empowerment framework hold in Trump's America? Reflecting on Trump's efforts to target and incorporate a group of motivated, previously non-participatory citizens with low-level information, misstatements, and distortions is where I begin in terms of defining the overarching context for better understanding recent breakthrough elections. Trump supporters who saw themselves as marginalized and looking for a symbolic candidate outside of the mainstream Washington establishment to empower and alter their political behaviors could be described in similar terms as supporters of previously marginalized symbolic candidates like Chisholm and Jackson, even as their privileged racial status, read white, overshadows their lower socioeconomic status, and their extremism sets them apart. Inspired to appear in our nation's capital on January 6th to quote unquote stop the steal and alter American presidential election results, they were equally motivated to observe ballot counting and allege voter fraud. It is not simply a question of whether presidential candidates like Donald Trump bolster political behavior, but the larger question is whether their office seeking as historic first stimulates active participation in the selection process. In the 2016 American presidential election, the Trump effect was based upon and founded on, quote unquote, making America great again, or bringing back the glory days of America. This has proven instructive as we consider the mobilizing effect of such a ready symbol that made the routine election controversial on account of his hate messaging, racist rhetoric, and emotion-satisfying gestures. Trump's flamboyant style and dramatic oratory resembled what I call a stage performance that conformed to his public persona as an extreme personality, which elicited standing ovations and enthusiastic applause from captive audiences at large super spreader events, that is in reference to the pandemic. Over time, Trump benefited from a shift in perception regarding his viability as a Republican presidential candidate and the spectacle of his campaign, which was interpreted as actively symbolic by several analysts who expressed disbelief and raised doubts about his long-term success. While he had no legacy of public service for which to cement his representational ties and affirm his leadership on the main stage of the Republican Party apparatus, he stood before us as a member of the business elite, a real estate developer, and a reality television actor best known for the phrase, "You're fired." At the same time, and no less importantly, there is perhaps no political office where traditional racial and gender stereotypes worked more to his advantage than the US presidency. Arguably the manliest of all elected offices, the default identity category for the American president has always been that of white and male. On this basis, Trump could be viewed as best suited for the role of commander-in-chief, as opposed to his Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton, because what it means to be a woman in the US does not correspond well with gendered expectations of what it means to be a president. While gender does not refer only to women and race does not refer only to Black, the tendency has been to assume that analyzing gender and race means focusing on the beliefs, behaviors, treatment, or experiences of women and Black people separate and apart from one another. Both the way Trump was presented in the media voluntarily as a function of his campaign activity and involuntarily as a function of political commentary contributed to his role as an iconoclastic candidate who perpetuated the status quo through his performance of toxic white masculinity. As such, he reinforced prevailing norms and practices that have long disadvantaged women and constrained men across race and ethnicity and electoral politics. Take, for example, the unique features of his 2016 campaign, specifically the stylized, repetitive speeches that were direct appeals aimed at arousing emotion among spectators and prospective voters alike. At campaign rallies, there were repeated attacks waged against his Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton, from chants of "Trump that bitch" and "lock her up," to Donald Trump asking audiences, "Do you think Hillary looks presidential? I don't think so." That reeked of gender bias and reified the masculine dominance of American presidential politics. Once Trump had taken the oath of office and emerged as incumbent, however, the empowering effect of being a historic first, that being in this case a Washington outsider, with no prior experience as either an office holder or candidate running for office had worn off. Republican voters, especially those former and present Republicans who established the Lincoln Project, sought to prevent his reelection in 2020 and endorsed Democratic presidential nominee Biden. They were not nearly as inspired by his second campaign, especially when he interjected himself into local contests and appeared at numerous rallies for House, Senate, and gubernatorial candidates where he called attention to himself, in effect making himself and his presidency a campaign issue. Readers must consider how negative feelings toward Trump's first term election resulted in the emergence of newly interested candidates, especially women and racial and ethnic minorities seeking and winning election to public office in 2018 and 2020. Take, for example, the Democratic takeover of the US presidency, House of Representatives, and Senate. It afforded contributors to this edited volume a remarkable opportunity to build upon the symbolic empowerment framework and provide important insights into several historic cases, including those of newly elected congresswomen of color, members of the Squad, Omar Presley Tlaib, as well as gubernatorial candidates like Andrew Gillum of Florida and mayoral candidate London Breed of San Francisco, all of whom are featured among the lineup of Historic First in recent years, who have effectively mobilized American voters across the color line. Not to suggest that intersectionality is shorthand for Black women, but this edited volume has the potential to expand the theoretical capacity of intersectionality research by linking this type of work to the campaigns and elections of Historic First. Which brings me to data, methods, research design. As shown here, one promising way to study Historic First and symbolic empowerment is to identify individual illustrative cases that capture the identity alignment between candidates and voters. The tie that binds each chapter, the symbolic empowerment framework. Notably, there's no comparable collection of original essays about Historic First candidates. Each chapter highlights backgrounds, considering the extent to which their race, gender, class, education, occupation, ideology, and party ID helped or hurt their standing with American voters. Each chapter features basic facts of the campaign while commenting on why the candidate either won or lost their election using the symbolic empowerment framework. Using a case study approach, contributors leverage poll data, voter turnout reports, news coverage, stump speeches, campaign materials, as well as interviews with candidates and constituents alike to determine how and to what extent Historic First unite diverse electorates, establish multiracial coalitions, and invoke a sense of pride among those they come to represent once elected to office. This approach constitutes but one way of applying the framework to several cases at once. The rich diversity between and among cases organized by level of office, the political context, spending, geographic space, whether it be a city, state, or district, the constituents, as well as the ground game, and the historic nature of the race, all combine to advance this theory of symbolic empowerment. As such, the text is exploratory in nature rather than definitive, and the framework helps researchers establish sufficiently similar patterns for which to evaluate new cases and adapt them to fit for comparative purposes, being mindful of the overarching context from which Historic First emerged is analytically important. So let's talk about some individuals. But what about those candidates that lost? Americanists have paid too little attention to trailblazing candidacies and their breakthrough elections, including newly emergent candidates who drop out after losing and once the momentum of their campaigns dissipate. Keeping in mind the original formulation of symbolic empowerment is sensitive to both the political context and an interdependent relationship that being in this case between what I call a pioneer cohort, followed by their contemporaries, researchers and readers alike must proceed with an acute understanding of what I call the long game when extending the symbolic framework to new cases. While most work on American elections is results-oriented, I would argue that the benefits of losing for historic first candidates are significant and necessary, insofar as they pave the way and create the opportunity for future candidates and subsequent victories. If the possibility of securing office seems remote, conventional wisdom dictates that the time, expense, and risk of a grueling electoral contest makes such a venture less gratifying, not worthwhile for most candidates. However, this logic rests on the assumption that securing the office is the only possible benefit of the selection process. It ignores the unexpected performance of such gubernatorial candidates as Stacey Abrams of Georgia and Andrew Gillum of Florida, and their ability as historic first to promote themselves as a broker, advancing an agenda on behalf of African-American voters and others who historically have been denied the franchise. Despite being electorally unsuccessful, the spectacle of their respective game-changing performances afforded each the opportunity to acquire experience, prestige, and visibility that neither would have acquired otherwise amongst the voting public, party elites, and political operatives. This becomes most salient when considering Stacey Abrams of Georgia. Surely we as political scientists, as well as the American public, can recognize the importance of these historic candidacies despite their losses, when thousands of African-American voters were effectively mobilized and newly registered during their respective campaigns. While neither Abrams nor Gillum became governor, the election results indicated the closest of contests, losing by 1%. And these new historic cases provide an opportunity to examine whether the concept of symbolic empowerment applies to the highest state level executive office, or whether it's something unique to the Democratic nominating contest for the US presidency. Whereas race, class, and gender often conspire against political activity, Gillum and Abrams breathe new life into these categories by activating symbolic empowerment at a time when the demographics of these states are changing substantially. Gillum, who would have been the first Black governor of Florida, was a viable candidate. He received national and international attention because of his historic candidacy. It challenged past notions about where candidates like himself could run competitively, and at the same time produced tremendous gains in voter turnout in a Republican state where Ron DeSantis, won election. Gillum's gubernatorial race fundamentally altered the national conversation around his electability, having started out as an underdog in the race. He situated Democratic strategists to better understand electoral challenges facing historic first candidates in the state of Florida, while also highlighting some remarkable assets in a Republican-controlled state, which begs that we watch for next time. As Sharon Wright, the author of that chapter, observes, the study of turnout in the aggregate and across groups by race or partisanship reveals only part of the story. Existing work on race in American elections has traditionally focused on such drivers of turnout, primarily among Black and white voters, as ideology, partisanship, education, income. Chapter 2 contributes to the literature on youth turnout in American elections. Based on CNN national exit poll data, examined alongside Florida statewide voter files over a 20-year period to determine whether voters were more interested in this particular gubernatorial race because of the historic nature of the campaign and its Black contender, observing along the way the significant increase in voter turnout among young adults, millennials, is significant and timely. Considering that young voters emerged as a decisive voting bloc in support of Gillum's historic candidacy, identifying the factors that increase greater electoral participation on the part of young voters is vitally important for future trailblazing candidates. Although partisanship has long been a prominent feature in state and national politics, understanding how race and partisanship interact to influence youth voter turnout will matter increasingly more in diverse electoral contests. And that is shown to us time and time again in the subsequent cases featured in this book. Youth turnout is key. Similarly, in Omar's 2018 congressional victory, it garnered tremendous national attention for breaking not just one, but multiple barriers. Omar became the first Black woman, first woman of color to represent the state of Minnesota in our nation's capital. Born in Somalia, a country in sub-Saharan Africa, Omar personally experienced the U.S. refugee settlement process. She is one of a small number of first-generation immigrants serving in the 116th Congress and the first ever African refugee. What explains her historic victory? And how have her distinctive experiences as a young, jihad-wearing Black immigrant woman shaped her leadership and impact as a national elected official? In chapter 3, Chambers and Elder draw on multiple sources, including interviews with constituents, to answer these key questions. Omar's success could be attributed to her ability to distinguish herself from not only the men in the race, but also from other women candidates with identity-based appeals. While the competition played up their past electoral experience, she relied more heavily on two things: values-driven language, her big picture goals, emphasizing the aspirational direction which she would like to move the needle left of center in terms of policy preferences. And her personal biography that demonstrated her aptitude to hold congressional office, despite her relative lack of experience vis-a-vis her opponents. Ayanna Pressley, similarly, was elected in 2018, becoming the first Black woman from Massachusetts to serve in the US House of Representatives, the first person of color to represent its only majority minority congressional district, composed of Boston and most of Cambridge. Pressley was no political newcomer to the city of Boston, but her campaign garnered widespread attention on account of her victory, having defeated a 10-term incumbent, Michael Quano, of the same political party. Given similar policy views made it difficult to differentiate the two candidates, and incumbency remains a powerful barrier to increasing the number of women in Congress. Such a racial and ethnically diverse district made descriptive and symbolic representation more relevant for that local voting eligible population. In chapter 4, myself and Lauren Jones argue that the electoral context mattered, given the historic nature of the campaign and its mobilizing effect on a racially and ethnically diverse electorate. Neither Cuprano nor Pressley could appeal to party alone. Identity-based appeals offered a strategic advantage and were well received by Democratic voters, given the demographic makeup of the district. Unlike her opponent, she demonstrated the need for what we call a preferable descriptive representative like herself, whose personal history, experience, and issue positions connect to the district. While emphasizing one's qualifications and ability to succeed in office is a priority for all candidates, Pressley had no choice but to rely on values-driven language and identity alignment to defeat the incumbent. Emphasizing her race and gender proved to be a smart strategy in an election where voters were not able to use party as a cue. Although highlighting qualifications and experience was the preferred tactic used by her opponent, it was important for Pressley to choose a strategy that best fit the electoral contest. Her identity played a pivotal role in shaping the dynamics of this nonpartisan election, where voters were unable to rely on partisanship as a decision-making shortcut, and at the same time, it did not distract from her qualifications and spawned remarkable turnout, higher than usual turnout in any previous election for this district. Few would argue that race and gender were the only factors that determined Pressley's victory or that of Omar's. There were several other influential factors that interacted and functioned simultaneously that determined the outcome of their elections. For example, like Gillum, the youth vote, and record high turnout. How these historic first candidates' race and ethnic identifications affected youth participation, previously inactive voters, and newly registered voters point to the continued significance of Black women in the Democratic Party coalition. There is merit in multiple group identity, given the perspective they bring as Black women to the office and exercise of political leadership. Both high quality challengers, they skillfully blended. Oh, and I realized I forgot my photos. I just got on a roll. I forgot my images. I'm there. Follow me. Here we go. I think I have Omar and Presley out of order. So this is Omar and this is Presley. Both high quality challengers, they skillfully blended mobilization with coalition building in a candidate-centered campaign that targeted underrepresented minorities and immigrant groups in a diverse electoral context. Taken together, the campaigns of Representatives Presley and Omar answer the following questions. How do race and gender affect who gets elected as well as who is voting? What issues do historic first candidates prioritize? Does diversity in electorates make a difference? In 2018, Rashida Tlaib made history by becoming the first Palestinian American woman elected from Michigan to the US House of Representatives. Her election was a triumph for Arab Americans, Muslim women, and progressive Democrats who wanted to shake up the establishment. While her election provided symbolic empowerment for Arab Americans, Muslims, and women, Tlaib faced a trade-off in having to avoid drawing attention to her identity, so not to distract from her qualifications and appeal to the district's majority Black population. We're talking Detroit. Although it is likely that Arab Americans would have voted for a Democrat, it was significant that a Palestinian American candidate who shared their ethnic and religious background was on the ballot. Still, she had to position herself as uniquely qualified to speak about and bring attention to economic justice and environmental protections, keeping Flint, Michigan in mind, right, as a democratic socialist. For Tlaib, the strategy that best fit the electoral context was one that emphasized substantive representation over descriptive and symbolic representation for the nation's third poorest district. A crowded field of Black candidates vying to represent a majority Black district with a small minority of Arab Americans and Muslims illustrates the necessity for Tlaib to distinguish herself from her opponents, who were presumably advantaged by their racial identity. This need for distinctiveness raises important questions about what the candidate chose to emphasize and de-emphasize over the course of her campaign, given the pragmatic need to emerge successful with the demographic majority being African American. In chapter 5, Michael Minta examines her rise to power. Having run a campaign absent identity-based appeals, she emerged triumphant given her fundraising networks, direct mobilization, really her ground game, her canvassing, her going door to door, and political acumen. Possessing the political experience and resources to professionalize her candidacy, Tlaib had the upper hand in elevating herself in the campaign. In 2018, moving on to London Breed. In 2018, Breed won a hotly contested mayoral election and became the first Black female mayor in San Francisco's 200-year history. If there was ever an election to expect pronounced differences in self-presentation by candidates, it would be in this mayoral election. Given the city's majority white and Asian populations, sparse Black population of roughly 5%, and storied history of LGBTQ activism, the need for this candidate like Tlaib to develop a distinctive self-presentation strategy raises similar questions about what she chose to emphasize and de-emphasize over the course of her campaign. In chapter 6, Jones, Robertson, and Frazier examine how Breed faced certain challenges when deciding which traits to focus on, having to distinguish herself not only from her openly gay white male opponent, but also the Asian woman in the race. Breed played up certain characteristics about herself based on the city's demographics with style, strategy, and message, while also positioning herself as uniquely qualified to speak about and bring attention to the issues, that being in this case affordable housing and homelessness. She successfully compiled the elements of her own personal history of homelessness, her issue positions, and firsthand experience with the city, having grown up there, using what we political scientists call a deracialized campaign strategy to attract the medium voter. For example, Breed definitely integrated her standing as a woman and role model for girls. Having to balance racial and ethnic solidarity with the pragmatic need for votes from the city's majority white and Asian populations, she made the best possible case for herself by emphasizing her upbringing, education, notable accomplishments, and connections to the city. While the existing literature indicates there may be some advantages to identity-based appeals, as was the case for Omar and Presley, it seems likely that playing up such factors as race and gender would be less advantageous and not the best state strategy for the metropolitan city of San Francisco, in the case of Breed, or Tlaib's majority minority district in Michigan. Race and ethnicity may not always be discussed openly throughout a campaign, whether it be a mayoral or congressional contest. Breed's historic victory over an Asian woman and openly gay white male suggests that she was linguistically and socially adept at demonstrating her ability to attain and succeed in elective office. The necessity of Breed having to distinguish herself from her opponents who were presumably advantaged by their identities, given a small minority of African-American voters, makes this mayoral contest much like Tlaib's congressional race. Neither Breed nor Tlaib were members of the demographic majority. Regardless of background, ambitious candidates like themselves must be strategic and compete for votes across racial and ethnic communities, inclusive of foreign-born immigrant and refugee populations. How these historic first candidates chose to present themselves showcases what I call the electioneering techniques that were required of them in comparable electoral environments to be successful as outgroup members of a demographic majority they did not descriptively represent. Both high-quality challengers, the selective use of language void of identity-based appeals was key to their electoral success. Taken together, the campaigns of Breed and Tlaib answer the following question: how is the race-neutral deracialization approach shaped by the size of respective identity groups in each constituency? So to my conclusion, some takeaways overall. Start First in US elections takes up the call to think about path-breaking candidates as motivational actors who are uniquely situated in an electoral system that often reifies binary thinking by privileging one axis of identity. Such identity categories as race and gender are not uniformly positioned, but situated differently within power hierarchies and shift depending upon the context where differences converge. Each chapter shows how identity politics is far more complex than reoccurring year of the woman or race trump gender frameworks suggest. An array of race-gender similarities and differences are evident in the experiences, activities, and accomplishments of path-breaking candidates. However, it seems that by all accounts, organizationally to mount a quote-unquote movement campaign and expand the electoral base through grassroots mobilization or canvassing, going door to door, is ultimately the best strategy for historic first. The major takeaways are clear. Historic first candidates are different because they understand the needs of multiply disadvantaged groups in ways that more traditional candidates do not, and because many, if not most of them, demonstrate a praxis orientation. The representation of those marginalized by multiple interlocking systems of power is inextricably tied to the fate of historic first candidates, as was shown by Georgia's 2021 runoff elections to the US Senate. And it has especially important implications for recent voting rights legislation, namely the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Future research might consider, and this is sort of my long range goal, a larger set of cases that vary by gender, race, ethnicity, and time simultaneously. So commonalities and differences can be systematically coded and problematized in sort of a large N data set. So then we can run predictive regression analyses. But that is without distorting the symbolic empowerment framework. The result might yield secondary categories that differentiate between winners and losers, establishing a pioneer cohort in relationship to contemporaries, or identify what we might call some partial cases that fail to symbolically empower. Indeed, for every Omar or Presley, there are surely other candidates like Gillum, who achieved identity alignment with segments of the mass public, but failed to win election. Adding new cases to make credible claims about both the complexity and importance of historic first at the level of state, local, and national government can only enhance our understanding of symbolic empowerment, as would interest in its utility beyond the United States. Whether variations in application or meaning, as well as categorization, are accepted or contested, will be an abiding issue for future research. And with that, I stop.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. That was a wonderful presentation. I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I'm going
I
to
do
just
have one plug. Let me
okay,
skip
go
one
ahead.
slide. Pre-order. There you go. A shameless plug. Now you missed the Black Friday special because paperback was 30. It was like $35. So you have missed the Black Friday special, but
That's all right. That's all right. I hope everyone gets a chance to get your book and read more of your work in general. And actually some of the questions I have some that are specific to some of your concepts and findings, but then also some just larger questions about your body of work in general.
Should I stop sharing? Can I stop
Yeah, go
sharing?
ahead. You can
Okay.
stop sharing. I'm just going to start with two so that we can save time. And I have others if I have time to address this, but I want to give other people a chance to ask you questions. But first, I'm going to start with a more general question. What has it been like as a scholar, as a professor, not only researching, but also teaching about these sorts of topics, and especially Black feminism, gender and racial inequality in this political environment? Have you faced any resistance, and how have you dealt with that?
Oh, wow. That is such a huge question, because I got a 20-year career. And I mean, the microaggressions began in grad school, okay? Because I went to a HBCU. So undergrad was a HBCU. So it started in grad school and it continued. I can go from grad school to even being on the job market and being asked, the school should I remain nameless, but it was an R1 institution. A couple of these institutions actually asked the same question. I can start with the job talk and being asked, can you tell me again why it's important to study Black women? And this is 2001. I'm on the job market. Political science is not doing intersectionality research. I was told I was not going to get a job by virtue of studying Black women in politics. And this is long after Patricia Hill Collins is on the scene. So political science was late by at least a decade, if not more. And so intersectionality became sexy probably around the time in which I got tenure and promotion in 2007. 2006, 2007. Prior to that, to study groups, period, to study race and ethnicity, you were going to be faced with a lot of challenges. There were no jobs being advertised as I had to apply for positions in US politics. They weren't explicitly defined in terms of intersectionality or race and gender, or what we call REP in the discipline. There were not intersectionality studies. So you asked me about my experience in the classroom. I feel very fortunate to be at a university where the overwhelming majority of the students are Democrats. And there's a disproportionate number that are what I call bleeding heart liberals. Because I left Purdue, I left Indiana, which was a solid red state. And all of the students in their classrooms at the time I was in grad school were diehard Republicans. So it was like a night and day. It was a refreshing experience to leave the middle of nowhere, West Lafayette, Indiana, where there was no Black radio station. And the weekend I moved to Connecticut, and I'll be dating myself, Janet Jackson had her Velvet Rope tour at the Excel Center in Hartford, Connecticut. I thought I had died and come to heaven. There was Black radio. Yeah, there was Black radio. You mean tell me I'm missing Janet Jackson live in concert, Velvet Rope tour? You know, I was ecstatic. I mean, I felt I was in prison for the last 5 years working on a PhD. So I was thinking, God, I had landed this job at a blue state. So that's not to say there weren't, challenges, but more challenges came pre-tenure, I felt. And then it's like promotion from assistant to associate was not challenging. And of course, there was a different set of actors than when I went up for promotion from associate to full. And I had a hell of a, to join that white boy network. I had to slay. I had some, they did not want to, and I stand before you, the only African-American woman at the rank of full in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Connecticut. And so in the context of the classroom, I teach a course called Black Feminist Politics. That draws a whole bunch of Black women. That draws a whole lot of students of color. And so it's also not like this required course to fulfill some diversity requirement. So I get students who want to be there, but let me teach a mainstream course like Intro to American Government, a service course early in my career. That's where the challenge, that's where, white males sort of attempt to challenge me as if I don't know US government, or they play the sort of Jeopardy game. Can you tell me, I call it the Jeopardy game, where they want you expect some obscure fact about almost like your own literacy test, but I'm a little special. I call them out, I get brought into the principal's office. I don't know how I managed to get promotions. I'm very outspoken, as you know, Angie. Angie took a class with me. We go back to UConn. She took a graduate seminar with me. But any woman that manages to go up through the ranks in academia, I would say, regardless of discipline, regardless of department, if you make it to the rank of full professor, in my humble opinion, you're a badass, period, dot. You're a badass, period. If you manage to fight these lions, tigers, and bears, you are, in my humble opinion, you are a badass. I think you have to believe in yourself. Over the years, one of my observations has been not enough women generally, people of color, really believe in themselves to the extent that you can block out the noise. And then it's how you deal with that so it doesn't compromise your health. What stress. And so I, knock on wood, I'm also, low blood pressure, low cholesterol, healthy. So somehow I'm waiting for the shoe to fall. I'm waiting for them telling me I'm sick. But every time I go to the doctor, like, your numbers are perfect. And I'm almost 50 and I got I just had a baby. That was an oops accident, but she's healthy, so so I'm doing something. I will say I do go to women of color retreats. I don't have a problem sleeping. My head hits the pillow and I go to sleep. Pre-pandemic, I was in the gym, and kickboxing helps me. I'm punching those colleagues, when I'm kickboxing, right? You have to find your safe harbor, your support system, your mentors. But my response is very organic when faced with microaggressions. I say what's on my mind. Now, I warn people that might not work for you. You might lose your job. I can't quite explain it. I think if I was at a different institution, maybe a different department, they would have handed me my tail. I don't know. But I got tons of stories, of they're trying to. I went into academia saying whatever the stereotype is, like they try to put all the work on all the service work on us that doesn't count. I'm not doing it. I'm saying no to. And I had one department head. I've had several department heads, but he was a very strong personality. And I told him no. And he was the first one to push back on my no. And I told him no a second time. He wanted me to do something called assessment. He comes down to my office the third time, asked me to do assessment again. And everybody knew him to be quite an alpha male. And he came down to my office, asked me a third time to do assessment. I looked at him. I said, what don't you understand? I said, no. I said, but you want me to do assessment? Okay, I'll do assessment, but I'm telling you right now, and I cocked my head, it ain't getting done. So I would see the white boys sign up, say, yeah, I'll do that service. And then the work of that committee wouldn't get done. So I was like, I can play that game too. Okay, you want to give me assessment? Go ahead, give me assessment. But I'm telling you right now. And I cocked my head just like that. It ain't gonna get done. And he looked at me, put his head down. He said, Evelyn, okay, what assignment do you want to do? So I was accustomed to department heads asking me what I wanted to do. What service assignment I wanted. They understood. And it's like, what memo did you miss? I tell you what, service assignment I'm going to do. That's how this works. But I feel like as long as you publish, I moved through my world saying, excuse my language, but don't tell me shit. I got an Oxford book. You got to know the games, though. You say University Press book, you better come with your University Press book. They say University Press book, you come with your, if I feel like, okay, I followed your rules. You say University Press book, you say X number of articles, bam, there it is. And I'm like, don't tell me shit. But I had that same attitude with my father. I had the same attitude growing up as a kid. I was like, I don't want to hear. I tell my father, I come home with A's. I don't want to hear nothing. Don't talk. I said, let's leave that speech for it. I named my sister who didn't have A's. I save that speech for her.
Well,
my father would say
that
mouth is gonna get you in trouble.
We have a question from the audience. I did have a question about intersectionality and how to approach that, but Renika has a question, I believe, about Black feminism. So I want to.
I came a little late, but I'm so glad to be here. Professor Evelyn, I think you're amazing in the little bit of time that I heard of you. I love educated Black woman, educated woman of color. We're going to change the world, all those great things. So thank you very much. So I'm a multimedia journalist student at Baruch, and I'm currently working on a podcast episode right now that is, the theme is Black feminism. Because of Professor Shelley, I'm taking her class, and she's inspired me from her Woman of Color class to start this podcast. And I already had an interest in podcasting journalism anyway. So my question for you is just a quick question about Kamala Harris, and how do you feel like she has impacted and affected Black feminism?
Oh my God. I was just interviewed by USA Today and had to comment on her low approval ratings last week, I think it was, or 2 weeks ago. And Kamala Harris is a very interesting character. So, and I have mixed feelings. I knew, based on the lineup of Black women, based on her credentials of having secured statewide office from California, she was the most likely candidate to be chosen among the lineup of Black women to be Biden's vice president. That being said, I do have friends who reside in California. And what I've been told, and this is only anecdotally, is that she wasn't quote unquote Black until she was running for VP, that she was Asian, that in California, her primary identity was South Asian. And she wasn't kind of celebrating her Blackness or being this Howard alum and this AKA, et cetera, et cetera. How accurate that is, I don't know. But being African American, we know we hold folks or politicians to a high standard. And especially when it comes to Blackness and Black identity, even in the case of Barack Obama, you know, the question was, is he Black enough? And I guarantee you, if Michelle did not have the melanin that she has and came from the South Side of Chicago, we might not have been as accepting of Barack Obama as the biracial candidate that he is. And so I don't necessarily view Kamala Harris as some Black feminist, someone who epitomizes Black feminism. She's no Ida B. Wells Barnett. She is no Shirley Chisholm. Okay, if we're going to keep it real and talk about the world of politics, okay, the person that really epitomized Black feminism in the world of politics is none other than Shirley Chisholm. And next to Shirley Chisholm, Kamala Harris falls short. Now, there's a reason why she's VP and Shirley Chisholm was not, right? Time, circumstance, but even, you know, some of these trailblazers, as I argue in the book prior to this one, you had to have the bombastic, in-your-face trailblazer, that pioneer, like Chisholm and Jackson, to pave the way, crack the door open for a more ideologically moderate candidate like Clinton and Obama. It's sort of like if white America had a choice between Dr. King or Malcolm X. You need there to be a firebrand like Malcolm X for white society to submit to Dr. King's demands. So they are all very necessary in order for there to be some semblance of progress made. So she's no Clarence Thomas, right? But she's no Shirley Chisholm either. So she falls somewhere in the middle. And having said that, to my mind, she is no bona fide Black feminist that I would hold up as such.
So you don't feel like so as far as the impact, you feel like it's a positive, negative, in between?
She's still an inspiring, iconic figure for Black women girls who aspire to assume elective office. I do believe she's still an inspiration. She's still a role model. And there is value in even the symbolic. There is still some value in the symbolic, even if it falls short of some of the substantive expectations we hold them to.
That was perfect. Professor, I hope you don't mind me using this audio clip. I'm journalist at the heart. So I was
no problem.
Oh, thank you so much. I don't know another opportunity I'll be able to find you to get this, because I'm sure you're very busy, and congratulations on your new book. So I just appreciate you answering this question for me. Thank you very much.
Does anyone else have any questions? And of course, I have several others I can ask, but we're running short on time and I want to give other people a chance to jump in. And if not, I can ask. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Hi, Evelyn. I'm Stephanie Golub. I am I'm the chair of the political science department at Baruch. I'm the first woman to be chair of the political science department ever. Woo! And so I can totally ratify what you say about our field. So we could go on and on. We could have a total other conversation about our field being. I mean, I know economics. I know Anna has left, but she has a really fine things to say about her about economics. But I wanted to ask you a question. I really am, congratulations on the second book, and congratulations on your work. It's really, this is really important work for our field. We just need to, break some way through to get our field to shake up. But I wanted to ask you a question about the candidates that lose. You're absolutely right. Our field, first of all, for many, many decades thought that political participation basically meant you voted, as if there was no other form of political participation that mattered, because you could count people who voted, but you couldn't count people that didn't vote, right? So I think it's really important to think about mobilizing people to vote, but also mobilizing people in other ways other than voting, right? So what I'm interested in is the impact of the candidates that lose, because I also think that's another contribution that you're making, right? Is saying that those people that don't win, the breakthrough candidates, these trailblazers, when they don't win, they also have an impact. But it made me think, cynic that I am, because political scientists are terribly cynical, that there are actually two possibilities that could happen after a candidate like this loses. One is that the people that came out and voted for the first time say, you know what, the system is terrible, I'm never voting again. Look what happens, I vote, I have no impact, why should I vote? Because they make it difficult, there's no voting holiday, gotta take time off of work, I can't do this. So the question, I'm saying there's gotta be data, and I'm sure that you have it, that shows that this doesn't happen. Right? Or under what circumstances does it happen? Under what circumstances doesn't it happen? And that the subsequent elections, someone who's mobilized to vote for one of these really inspiring candidates ends up not voting or sitting out the next election. And then the second piece is that these candidates that make a huge impact and they lose by this much, they've already provoked a backlash. They've already provoked a backlash that then leads to, even if they lose, look what happens with Stacey Abrams. Even when she loses, it brings about a push toward restricting voting rights. In Florida, the same thing happened, right? This kind of, this sort of backlash. Not to say that it's the fault or the responsibility of these candidates, but that this is another dynamic that's happening in American politics. That the rise of identity politics on the right, and Donald Trump as a historic first, if you want to call him that, in terms of his profile, it is, it's concerning to me, and I think about, what kinds of ways that these historic first candidates mobilize people that might help to maintain those coalitions, as Stacey Abrams is trying to do, not just for future elections, but to push back also against the backlash, right? So this will tell you, I think you're absolutely right. This is a research program that has a lot of future. So thank you very much, and feel free to pick anything that you want to respond to. That I realized that it was a lot.
I have several answers. I have different, like my mind goes in multiple directions. So there's two things like I challenge our discipline to think about is how do we define success, especially when you're a numerically underrepresented group? And there's no possible way, if everyone casts their ballot who you represent descriptively, who's a member of a underrepresented, marginalized group, can't win. So Chisholm was not going to win in 1972. Jackson was not going to win in 1984, even if every single person in the United States that has some melanin cast their ballot. So what are they to do? And so mainstream political science would cast them aside as losers, right? But it forces you to rethink when a candidate such as Chisholm and Jackson are representing a numerically underrepresented group. And you're talking about Chisholm's running 72. This is shortly after a Voting Rights Act, a grassroots Black liberation struggle. You know, where just prior to that, you had Atlantic City and the testimony of Fannie Lou Hamer and others from the state of Mississippi going there to unseat the regulars at the Democratic National Convention. This is a breakthrough candidate in so many ways, given the time, space, and context, where you go from Selma, Alabama, and attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to having a Black woman running for president of the United States. That's an aha moment where you go from being effectively disenfranchised via lynching, you know, in the states of Mississippi and Georgia, Louisiana, Arkansas, etc., to actually having a Black woman as bombastic, in your face, and vocal as she was. If nothing else, that's awe-inspiring just to listen to. And so when I mentioned this coattails advantage, the Black woman who worked her campaign went on to head the Congressional Black Caucus. The very Black women that were inspired by Chisholm's candidacy worked her campaign in California, went on to run for elective office themselves, and eventually found themselves in Washington, D.C., heading up the Congressional Black Caucus as representative. So that's that coattails advantage. After Barack Obama won, all of a sudden, 7 Black men are running for mayor of my hometown. That's that spillover effect. How many people who previously hadn't considered running for elective office think, aha, 2019 is considered the year of the Black woman mayor. In my home state of Louisiana, for the first time, 3 of the largest cities in the state of Louisiana elect Black female mayors: Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and Shreveport. And so we have to think more broadly and openly about what do we call impact? You know, what is impact? What do we call success? You know, in political science, we like to identify like this one thing. You know, it might even be one variable, like one survey question is like a catch-all. And what I feel my work does through a lens of intersectionality is forces us to reconsider what we as political scientists have taken for granted. You know, if you were to rethink electoral success, what does that look like? So Stacey Abrams could have been just as discouraged as the voters who went out and supported her candidacy via the ballot. What did she do with that energy? She paid it forward, right? And she made it possible for Raphael Warnock and Ossoff to be elected in Georgia. She turned, it's the best revenge, right? She turned Georgia from red to blue. And so her story, her candidacy is quite inspiring. Even though she lost the gubernatorial contest, what subsequent impact did she have on the electorate? I mean, it's far reaching. It's far reaching. It's why we have like a 50-50 split in the Senate, with Kamala Harris being sort of the tiebreaker. So when I listen to your question, I start thinking about what is success from not the dominant view, the mainstream book. What constitutes success for a numerically underrepresented group as you kind of chip away at some of these barriers and challenges? And then how do we rethink impact? What does that look like? So those were a couple of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. I put some questions that I wanted us to we can sort of leave and continue thinking about, but I'm going to, first of all, do you have time for one more question? And I can pose both to you and you can pick which one.
Sure.
Okay, and we've talked about this a lot.
My son may be walking through the door momentarily. He gets off the school bus at this time.
I'd love to see him again. We've talked about this before, but how do you conduct intersectional research in a way that doesn't privilege or whitewash one system of oppression over another? And so that's one thing I was thinking about. And the other thing, and again, you can pick which one you think you have time to address, but I know you've done some work, some of your early work is on linked fate. And so what is linked fate and what role do you see it playing in the context of these elections, or have you seen it changed at all also in the context of the movement for Black lives?
I'm gonna take the first question because the second one is lengthy. That's more complicated. I see the second one as more complicated to talk about linked fate. If you had to, did you put that one in the, how do you conduct intersectional research in a way that does not privilege or whitewash? I constantly ask myself, I always look at the mainstream literature with a very critical eye and rethink, how could this be done differently? How do you answer this question from an alternative point of view and a different lens? I think, because you're a sociologist, I think you can appreciate this, because Patricia Collins in Black Feminist Thought talks about sort of the domestic and her view of sort of the household. And there's a quote or phrase that she lifts from this Black female domestic that says, if you never do your own laundry, you might think some fairy comes along and kind of does it for you, right? And I think I'm constantly looking at the mainstream literature with a critical eye, with a critique, and asking, so even with my early work, people that studied feminist consciousness or gender consciousness would design these survey questions with white women's lived experience in mind. So for instance, they'd ask the question, how often do you think of yourself as a homemaker? And so if you ask that question to a Black woman who's all her life probably been working as a white woman's domestic, it'd be never. That doesn't mean she's got a feminist consciousness, you know? And then they would ask the survey respondent to evaluate the women's liberation movement along a feeling thermometer, a 0 to 100 point scale, with a 0 being cold and 100 being warm. Black women give the women's liberation movement a low feeling thermometer score. And political scientists who studied feminist consciousness would say, oh, see, Black women lack feminist consciousness. No, how about they know the history of the women's liberation movement as being a racist movement that did not prioritize their interest and policy goals, you know, especially as domestics, you know, if they had been unionized or having wanted kind of Social Security benefits for their work. There's a class component that was missing there. And so when I think it starts by having really a critical eye and not taking for granted mainstream literature on face value. And for a long time, political science has just sort of removed our cases from the data sets because we were such anomalies. So if the mainstream literature says that socioeconomic status predicts voter turnout and political behavior, guess what? Black women were out voting, every other socioeconomic demographic, but then we got low SES. Your model does not predict the behavior of other racial and ethnic groups. So for example, Asian Americans might have the highest level of SES, but they got the lowest voter turnout. So this model was based on white Americans. And I entered graduate school, I made that observation probably first year of grad school, that what we're studying is white voting behavior. And then political scientists didn't even see the problem in admitting that they removed all the cases of Black Americans out of their data sets. They weren't even conscious of how that was kind of problematic. When we talk about the American voter, which is considered sort of the seminal text on American political behavior. And so I'd say it starts by reading critically and reimagining what the same theory or what the same phenomena, how it might be explained in alternative ways if informed by a different experience, a different pair of eyes. I think it starts there, thinking very critically and not taking for granted what you're reading. And of course, in grad school, that's what we're supposed to be doing: critique, thinking critically, and then imagining the alternative. Sometimes that means, I say, being very true to what do you know about this demographic, culturally, socioeconomically, historically, and how that might influence even your interpretation of the data. So political scientists could have an outcome, could have a result, and also misinterpret the results. As I offered up the examples of the survey items that were used to measure feminist consciousness among women. And so they didn't even recognize the problems with the survey item, the tool itself. And it lent itself to a wrong interpretation of the data. And so as a person of color, it means question. And then you're tasked with sort of rewriting the survey questions. You're tasked with, and here's my son trying to peek in the, he's trying to take a peek. And yes, so you're tasked. I didn't warn him that I was doing this when he came home. I thought we'd be done before, but I feel like you have a responsibility to sort of critique and rewrite the narrative. You're charged with rewriting that narrative because not enough people are even collecting the data and publishing the work. There's not enough Evelyn Simiens or Angie Beemans. We still represent historic first in our own right. And so it also means training others and creating a pipeline of students that will take up this work as well. Training others to think critically. And I feel a special kinship with both you and Tom. I was actually on Tom is her partner, her husband. Tom, I was on his dissertation committee. And so it's training others to do this work as well and increasing our numbers. But when I think about your question, I really think it's so important to, when you're reading, you know, this literature, even the most seminal texts, really think critically if it's reflective of and indicative of other experiences.
Thank you so much. And you even touched on another question that I had on my list about mentorship, because that is such an important, your teaching and mentorship is such an important part of your career. And I just wanted to recognize that. And so you addressed that part of what we're doing and why it's so important. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. Your presentation, your answers, it's so inspiring. And especially since I know that we've cut into your family time here, I really want to thank you for being here. It's so lovely to see you again. Thank you, Dr. Simien.
He's always interested. He's always interested, knows he always wants to see how many faces are in the screen. Sometimes he's sitting next to me. He tries to ask questions. But it was a pleasure. It was good to see you. And it was good to see all of you and answer your questions. And I so enjoyed talking about this work. And it gave me the first initial opportunity to discuss the book that's now in production. So you were the first. So I was able to cut my teeth, so to speak, and give a presentation on this topic. So I thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure on my end as well. So
Thank you everyone for joining us.
And again, this recording of this will be made available sometime next week. Everyone who's registered, I'll send you the link. And now I am going to stop recording. And again, thank you everyone for attending.